90% of the calories that built every empire you have ever studied came from three plants. One of them is a grass, a weed, really, by origin. Something that grew knee-high on a rocky plateau in what is now southeastern Turkey. Unremarkable to look at, ignored by every large animal that mattered. Today, it covers 220 million hectares of the Earth's surface. More land than the entire country of Australia planted edge to edge. No other organism in the history of complex life has so thoroughly reorganized the behavior of a single species. Not the horse, not the ox, not the dog. A grass did it. Walk into any supermarket in Frankfurt, Lagos, or Karachi, and the arithmetic is startling. Roughly 40% of the calories on those shelves trace back to Triticum aestivum, common bread wheat. The flour in the bread, the starch thickening the soup, the base of the pasta and the biscuit and the beer. Wheat is so embedded in the modern food supply that removing it would not produce hunger in isolated pockets. It would collapse supply chains on 6 continents simultaneously. We did not choose this dependency recently. We built it over 11,000 years, one harvest at a time, and we did it without ever fully understanding what we were agreeing to. To find where this began, you have to go back to a specific landscape that no longer exists in the form that mattered. The Fertile Crescent of 9,600 BCE was not the arid, politically fractured region it became. It was a mosaic of oak woodland, open grassland, and seasonal rivers that flooded predictably and receded, leaving behind black, nitrogen-rich soil. In the hills of what archaeologists now call the Karakodag Mountains in southern Anatolia, wild einkorn wheat grew in dense, natural stands. Hunter-gatherer communities harvested it seasonally using flint-bladed sickles. They ground the grain on flat stones. They ate it as a porridge. They moved on. The transition from harvesting wild wheat to cultivating it did not happen in a single season or a single generation. Geneticist Manfred Huhn and his colleagues published a study in Science in 1997, identifying the Karakodag region as the single origin point for domesticated einkorn, based on DNA analysis of 68 wild and 194 domesticated varieties. The genetic bottleneck was narrow. The founding population of cultivated einkorn was small, meaning this shift happened in one place, probably within one community, over a period of a few centuries at most. That community almost certainly did not know what they were starting. Domesticated wheat differs from wild wheat in one crucial way that only makes sense from the human perspective. Wild wheat has a brittle rachis, the central stem, holding the grain clusters together. When wind blows through a wild stand at maturity, the rachis shatters and the seeds scatter, which is how the plant reproduces. Domesticated wheat evolved through human selection of the most productive individual plants, a tough rachis that holds the grain in place. The seeds stay on the stalk until a human hand harvests them. This made farming more efficient. It also made wheat completely dependent on human beings for reproduction. Neither partner in this arrangement signed a contract. Both became dependent on the other without consultation. From the Karakodag Hills, cultivated einkorn and its close relative emmer spread outward across the Fertile Crescent at a rate archaeobotanist Dorian Fuller of University College London has estimated at roughly 1 kilometer per year, based on radiocarbon dates from dozens of early agricultural sites. By 8000 BCE, wheat cultivation had reached the Jordan Valley. By 7000 BCE, it appeared in the Zagros foothills of western Iran. By 6500 BCE, it crossed into Europe through Anatolia, and the first Greek farmers were planting it in Thessaly. The grass was moving, not on its own. It moved because every community that adopted it found, within a generation or two, that it could support larger populations than foraging ever had. Wheat did not make life easier. It made more life possible. That is a different thing entirely. The settlement it enabled was not comfortable by any measure a modern person would recognize. The earliest wheat farmers of the Near East showed, in their skeletal remains, a dramatic increase in tooth decay, iron deficiency anemia, and spinal compression from carrying heavy grain loads. Richard Steckel and Jerome Rose's 2002 analysis of skeletal health across 12,000 years found that average human health declined measurably with the adoption of agriculture and did not recover to pre-agricultural baselines until the late 19th century CE. The farmers were shorter than their hunter-gatherer predecessors. They worked longer hours. They ate a less varied diet. They got sick more often from living in proximity to stored grain, which attracted rats, which carried disease. They also built Jericho. The oldest continuously inhabited city in the world, Jericho shows evidence of permanent settlement from around 10,000 BCE. Its famous walls, among the earliest monumental architecture ever constructed, were not built to impress. They were built to protect grain storage. The tower at Jericho, 8 meters in diameter and still standing 9 meters tall after 10 millennia, predates the Egyptian pyramids by 7,000 years. It was not a temple. Archaeological analysis of the site by Ofer Bar Yosef of Harvard suggests it was a communal granary and flood control structure. The first great human building project was a warehouse for wheat. This pattern repeated itself across the ancient world with a consistency that amounts to a rule. Wherever wheat took hold as the primary caloric base, three things followed in sequence: population growth, surplus storage, and hierarchy. The surplus made the hierarchy possible. Someone had to manage the granary. Someone had to decide who got grain during a drought year and who did not. Power in early human settlements was not religious or military in origin. It was logistical. Control the wheat, control the people. By 3100 BCE, the administrators of the Uruk period in Mesopotamia had developed the earliest known writing system not to record religious texts or royal decrees, but to track grain rations. The proto-cuneiform tablets discovered at Uruk show a single symbol repeated thousands of times, a stylized bowl representing a grain measure alongside numerical notations. The first literature was an inventory. The first bureaucracy was a grain office. Every complex human institution that followed, from taxation to law codes to professional armies, derived its operating logic from this original accounting problem. How do you fairly distribute a storable calorie surplus among people who did not all contribute equally to producing it? The Sumerians found one answer. The Egyptians found another. Both answers involved wheat. In Egypt, wheat did not merely feed people. It replaced money. The word the ancient Egyptians used for grain, jafau, was also used to mean provisions, wealth, and sustenance in a general sense. The state collected wheat as tax, paid workers in wheat, and distributed wheat to maintain political loyalty. The construction of the pyramids at Giza was financed in wheat. Recent excavations at the workers' village south of the Giza Plateau, led by Mark Lenner, uncovered bakeries capable of producing industrial quantities of bread. Accounts from the Old Kingdom suggest that the workers building the Khufu pyramid received a daily ration of roughly 10 loaves and a measure of beer, itself brewed from wheat or barley. The pyramids were not built by slaves. They were built by a labor force paid in fermented grain. The Roman Republic understood this arithmetic with unusual clarity. Annona, the Roman concept of the grain supply, was not merely an economic concern. It was a political one. The Roman satirist Juvenal identified the essential formula of Roman governance as panem et circenses, bread and circuses, in his satires of around 100 CE. He meant it critically. The Roman state subsidized or outright distributed free grain to citizens of Rome from the 2nd century BCE onward, a program known as the frumentatio. At its height, roughly 200,000 Roman male citizens received a monthly grain dole. The logistics required to feed that city, which had reached perhaps 1 million inhabitants by the 1st century CE, demanded wheat from Sicily, Sardinia, North Africa, and Egypt in quantities that reorganized the agricultural economies of entire provinces. When Rome's supply chains failed, the city starved. When the city starved, emperors fell. Commodus was assassinated in 192 CE during a period of acute grain shortage. The military anarchy of the 3rd century CE was inseparable from repeated disruptions to the North African wheat supply caused by civil war and plague. Edward Gibbon, writing in The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire in 1776, pointed to military overextension as Rome's primary weakness. He was not wrong, but he underweighted the grain problem. Every army Rome fielded needed roughly 3 pounds of grain per soldier per day. The logistics of moving that grain to mobile armies across hundreds of miles of frontier became, by the late 3rd century, more expensive than the armies themselves could extract from the territories they occupied. The Arab conquests of the 7th century CE moved so quickly in part because they moved through the grain belt. Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and Mesopotamia, all of them wheat-producing regions, fell within 20 years of Muhammad's death. The caliphate that emerged from those conquests was, among other things, a grain administration. The jizya, the tax imposed on non-Muslim populations under early Islamic law, was frequently paid in wheat and agricultural produce. The organizational genius of the early caliphate was not primarily theological or military. It was fiscal, and its fiscal system ran on the same logic as every grain empire before it. The medieval European arrangement was different in form but identical in essence. Feudalism was reduced to its mechanics, a system for extracting grain surplus from a peasant population and redistributing it upward. The tithe owed to the church, typically 1/10 of agricultural production, was calculated in grain bushels. The rent owed to a lord was grain. The fines imposed by manorial courts were grain. A peasant family in 13th century France or England lived and died within the radius their grain surplus allowed them. A bad harvest meant debt. A second bad harvest meant selling land or children. A third meant death. The Black Death, which killed between 30 and 60% of Europe's population between 1347 and 1351, changed the calculus in ways that took generations to appear fully. With roughly half the agricultural labor force dead, surviving peasants found themselves with leverage they had never possessed. Wages rose. Serfdom began its slow collapse. But the immediate aftermath of the plague was not liberation, it was famine. Fields that had been marginal under normal conditions were simply abandoned. The wheat supply contracted faster than the population did in some regions, and the 14th century ended with recurring subsistence crises across England, France, and the Italian peninsula. The response to that instability eventually produced something new. Northern Italian merchants, particularly in Florence and Genoa, began trading grain futures, contracts to buy wheat at a fixed price at a future date, as a hedge against harvest uncertainty. The grain futures market of medieval Italy is the direct ancestor of the commodity exchanges of Chicago and London. The financial instruments that govern trillions of dollars of global trade today were invented because medieval merchants needed a way to price the risk of wheat harvest failure. Every credit default swap, every futures contract, every derivative instrument that has since been invented to manage commodity risk traces its conceptual lineage back to a Florentine merchant betting on whether Sicilian wheat would arrive before winter. The Columbian exchange of the late 15th century did something to wheat that nothing before had managed. It expanded the crop's geographic range by roughly 40%. Spanish colonists planted wheat in Mexico within a decade of Cortez's arrival. Portuguese traders introduced it to Brazil. English colonists brought it to Virginia and later to New England, where it initially struggled against a climate suited to maize. The spread was not symmetrical. Wheat moved from the Old World to the New. Maize, tomatoes, potatoes, and tobacco moved in the other direction. But wheat carried a symbolic weight that the other crops did not, because wheat made bread, and bread was the body of Christ in Catholic theology, which meant that planting wheat in the Americas was not merely an agricultural act, it was a sacramental one. The encomienda system in Spanish colonial Mexico required indigenous laborers to produce wheat for Spanish consumption, even in regions where the soil and altitude made the crop difficult to grow. The Spanish colonial administration distinguished formally between pan de Castilla, Castilian bread made from wheat, and tortilla, made from maize, treating the distinction as a marker of civilization. Indigenous communities that ate maize were categorized as requiring further conversion and supervision. The grain you grew determined your legal status. Wheat meant European. Wheat meant Christian. Wheat meant, in the colonial vocabulary, fully human. The politics of wheat did not simplify as the modern era advanced. The Irish famine of 1845 to 1852 is remembered as a potato famine, and the proximate cause, the Phytophthora infestans blight that destroyed potato crops across consecutive years, was indeed a fungal pathogen targeting potatoes. But wheat continued to be grown in Ireland throughout the famine years. It continued to be exported to Britain throughout the famine years. In the worst year of the famine, 1847, Ireland exported 4,000 tons of grain to Britain, while approximately 1 million Irish people starved. The famine was not a failure of agricultural production. It was a failure of distribution, enforced by property law and political calculation. The people who starved did not own the wheat. In 1943, the same logic killed 3 million people in Bengal. The Bengal famine occurred during wartime, when British colonial administrators prioritized food exports for the war effort and military stockpiles over civilian distribution in India. Wheat and rice were available in Bengal and in India generally. Amartya Sen, in his 1981 study Poverty and Famines, demonstrated that virtually every major famine of the 20th century occurred not because food was absent, but because poor populations lost the purchasing power or legal entitlement to access food that physically existed. The Bengal famine was, by this analysis, a wheat administration failure of the same type that had killed peasants in medieval France and workers in late Roman provinces. The Green Revolution of the 1960s seemed to break this pattern. Norman Borlaug, an American agronomist working in Mexico under a Rockefeller Foundation program, spent nearly 2 decades crossbreeding wheat varieties to produce semi-dwarf strains that allocated more of the plant's energy to grain production rather than to stalk height. The resulting varieties, released as IR8 and the Norin 10 hybrids, were capable of producing 2 to 3 times the yield of traditional varieties under high fertilizer and irrigation inputs. Borlaug won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970. His acceptance lecture estimated that the new wheat varieties had prevented 1 billion deaths from starvation. That number is contested, but no serious analyst disputes that the semi-dwarf wheat revolution prevented a large-scale humanitarian catastrophe in South Asia and sub-Saharan Africa during the 1960s and 1970s. The cost of that revolution is still being calculated. High-yield semi-dwarf wheat requires 3 to 5 times more synthetic nitrogen fertilizer than traditional varieties to achieve maximum output. The Haber-Bosch process, which industrially fixes atmospheric nitrogen into ammonia for fertilizers, consumes roughly 2% of global energy production annually. That single industrial process is responsible for feeding approximately half the world's current population. It is also responsible for a substantial fraction of global greenhouse gas emissions and for the nitrogen pollution of river systems across every agricultural continent. The Green Revolution did not solve the wheat problem. It deferred it at scale. As of 2025, climate projections published by the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research show that wheat yields in South Asia and the Middle East are expected to decline by between 6 and 15% per degree Celsius of average temperature increase. The regions most dependent on wheat as a calorie source are the regions that will lose wheat production capacity first as temperatures rise. The countries with the thinnest food security margins, Egypt, Pakistan, Yemen, Ethiopia, are also the countries most exposed to wheat price volatility. The 2010 Russian drought, which destroyed roughly 30% of Russia's wheat harvest, triggered a global wheat price spike that contributed to the food insecurity that preceded the Arab Spring uprisings of 2011. The connection is not metaphorical. High bread prices appeared in the protest literature of Tahrir Square. The link between wheat and political instability has not weakened in 11,000 years. The grass that no large animal thought worth eating in the Karakadog Mountains built Jericho, financed the pyramids, paid for the legions, structured feudalism, created the futures market, divided the colonized from the colonizers, and killed 3 million Bengalis in a year when there was enough food to feed them. Every piece of bread consumed in the next 24 hours, somewhere between 5 and 6 billion pieces globally, is a product of a relationship that began with a single community in southern Anatolia, selecting the least shattering stalks from a wild stand and saving their seeds. The Earth's surface, viewed from low orbit, shows the wheat belt as a continuous band of pale gold running across Eurasia, from northern France through Ukraine, Kazakhstan, northern China, and across North America from Kansas through Alberta. This band is a geological feature now. It has altered the soil chemistry, the water table, and the atmospheric composition of the planet. It took 11,000 years to build. The planet has been spinning for 4.5 billion. From that distance, the entire agricultural revolution, the cities, the empires, the famines, the futures markets, the green revolution, the nitrogen crisis, all of it occupies a duration roughly equivalent to the last half second of a 24-hour clock. The grass arrived, and the ape reorganized itself around it, and the surface of a planet changed, and almost no time has passed at all.